Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, can Trump postpone the elections on November 3rd? And what if he doesn't recognize the results? We ask our guest, Emilio Viano, political analyst, a professor emeritus of American University. Emilio Viano, a warm welcome to the program. Emilio, can President Trump postpone the presidential elections on November 3rd?
The president cannot change the date of the election. It's clear in US law that only Congress can do that. Moreover, the 20th of January is the day when the term of the president and vice president expire. So they need to have somebody to take over, if it is someone new who has been elected, or to be sworn in again as the president re-elected. So there are very clear time parameters that do not really favor postponing the election.
His argument is it's going to be the biggest fraud in history. That's his words. Could be a fraud?
Well, the president and many people who support him, and even some of his adult children, like to indulge in these conspiratory theories. That there are conspiracies, that there are secret organizations, that there are things happening that are difficult to detect. And certainly the electoral fraud has been a theme of Trump presidencies. Why? First, because he fought it since many people questioned in reality the legitimacy of his election, because he lost by 3 million votes of the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. This was stinging for him, as we all know, and he tried to claim that those 3 million votes in favor of Hillary Clinton, so that she would be the winner if we had a direct popular vote election, were due to fraud, were by people that have supposedly died many years ago, by illegal immigrants and whatever. So this was why he became a little bit obsessed with this theory of fraud in the election, to kind of diminish the loss of the popular vote that he felt was kind of questioning the legitimacy of his presidency. And now, obviously, he's trying to sow discord, to sow the doubt, to prepare the terrain for questioning the results of the election, and possibly, we hope not, of course, even refusing to accept the results. So it is a maneuver in preparation of the day of the election.
Isn't a little bit suspicious that he is naming as a director of the United States Postal Service one of his biggest donors, and now not necessarily the US Postal Service is going to cooperate in order to make sure that everybody could be able to vote by mail?
Well, that is really one of the serious considerations, because this year, especially due to the coronavirus epidemic, it is expected that many, many millions of people that never did it before will vote by mail. And the president has already declared that this is very dangerous and that will lead to uncounted examples of fraud. And definitely, obviously, if millions of people vote by mail, we will have to depend on the US Postal Service to deliver efficiently and speedily this mail so that it can be received on time and counted. And we know that the US Postal Service is faced with a big deficit and has already been declared almost defunct by President Trump, that would like to eliminate it and privatize that service. And it doesn't work very well. It has slowed down considerably, even in the delivery of first-class mail. So there is indeed that as a problem that would work in favor of Trump questioning the result of the election. Why am I saying this? Because many states limit the opening of the ballots sent by mail to the day of the election, November 3rd this year. They don't allow them to be open as they come in, which would facilitate, of course, counting at the end, the very same day of the election, who won and who didn't. Why do they do that? Because there was the fear that if they open them before the election, the results might filter out and might influence the vote on the day of the election and create problems. But this is going to create a major problem. If there are millions of votes to be delivered by what is a relatively inefficient postal service and have to be open that day, the 3rd of November, it will be impossible to have a definitive result by the end of the day, just not possible. And maybe it may take several days to achieve at least an idea. And this will give Trump an excellent opportunity to start again questioning the election, questioning the results, asking what's going on. Something may be happening. There are conspiracies against me. And try to sow this fear and this distrust on the part of Americans that might even give him enough strength to then refuse to accept the results. And this is not new in the US. Remember what happened with the election of George Bush's son and Al Gore, where there was at one point the difference of a little over 500 votes between them in Florida. Well, there was a recount going on in that state, in Florida, with the support of the Florida Supreme Court. Bush went to the Supreme Court of the US that interfered in the election in the state of Florida, which is really legally questionable, and basically stopped the recount and gave the election as a gift, if you want, to George W. Bush. Well, we had already an example like that of discord, of dissension, who won, who didn't, who really has the votes, where is that, do we have to recount? And the courts giving the victory to the person that most probably, many people say in that case, did not win the popular vote.
And Emilio, what happened if President Trump doesn't recognize the results of the November election and the 20th of January, the day that is always the transition of power, and he doesn't want to leave the White House? Could he be removed by force?
Well, that would create a major, major crisis in the US, obviously, a major constitutional crisis. But we have to remember that after the 3rd of November, he is still president until the 20th of January. The US does not function like other countries, particularly the UK, where you can have someone elected on Monday and they're already on Downing Street offices by Wednesday or Thursday, which is almost incredible. Here, it takes weeks, basically over 2 months, before there is the change of power. And so he would be president for another 2 months and a half almost. And he would have at his disposal the armed forces, the federal police, the pulpit of the White House, his supporters claiming that they are defending him from fraud and corruption, and it could create a major, major crisis that would be very difficult to resolve, and it would be something totally new in the history of this country that has always presented itself since the early 1800s, since 1804, as a model of a country where power is passed from the previous president and the new president without any violence or without any questions. It would certainly affect the image of the democracy of the United States. But I think that we have to be ready, unfortunately, for something like that possibly taking place, which of course would be extremely damaging to democracy in this country.
Precisely. The idea that he has already put in question the possibility of fraud, is it hurting the image of the U.S. all over the world regarding its institutions, its democracy?
Well, actually, that has been one of the themes of the campaign of Trump and of other politicians, the distrust of the government, which is part, per se, of the American mentality based on the American Revolution against the established authority of the King of England. Well, so there is already this let's say, foundation of distrust in the government, which has its positive aspects as well. But Trump has exploited it enormously. He has talked about coming to Washington to drain the swamp, implying that there was a lot of corruption and a lot of dysfunction in Washington. And therefore, it could be attractive to his base that he is the champion of streamlining the government, of defending the common man, or ejecting intellectuals and professional politicians. And so in a way, there is a little bit already a cultural preparation for this, to question the government, to question the decisions of the government. And Trump could definitely exploit them to say, yes, I've been thrown out. This is a coup. I was elected and I am not going to leave, and I need you to support me. Hopefully it will not happen. Hopefully the Republicans will recover their spine and say absolutely not, we're not going to support that. But it will certainly be a major crisis in the history of the United States. Let's hope it doesn't happen, of course.
And regarding polls, he is in a free fall, he meaning Trump, in a free fall in every possible category. We're talking about the leadership regarding the pandemic, the economy, the social and racial issues. What he could do in the 90 days that are left in order to turn it around, or he's already lost, and that's why he started to anticipate that if he loses, it's going to be because of a fraud.
Well, he has a number of real challenges in front of him, and he has been roundly criticized for ineptitude and lack of preparation and ability to address, for example, the coronavirus epidemic. Now, it would serve him very positively if he was able to put it under control. And he has tried to do that by denying that it is an epidemic, by denying that it is a serious situation for the country, by saying, oh, it is not so bad, and one day we will wake up and it will disappear. Well, it is not disappearing. On the contrary, it is acquiring new force. So I think that his hope is to be able to announce very soon a vaccine. And if they can announce a vaccine, then they say the problem is solved. Don't worry, you just get the vaccine and you can go back out to the bar and to play and to travel and not worry about anything. The problem that we are faced with is that there may be very serious political pressure on those working on vaccines to come up with one as fast as they can, cutting corners in the procedure to establish that it really works, which would have dramatic negative impact later on when people who think they are vaccinated are going to get the disease and die. So I think that is a way of trying to address that issue. I think that we will hear more and more from him about that the vaccine is almost ready. It will be ready by October, and everything will be solved. Don't worry. The problem is it really the correct vaccine? And that is something that might be a major problem in the future. The economy is also the other major problem he's faced with. And it is, I could say, the source of his pride and joy, and his claim to be reelected, that of course he exaggerated completely, rebuilt the economy and made it vibrant and super successful, and therefore you should keep me in office. Actually, the economy, because of coronavirus and the poor way to handle the coronavirus crisis, has now stalled, and there is the other point that President Trump is using to fire up his base and also to portray himself as a defender of the people is the theme of law and order. That, as we already said, is nothing relatively new in the history of the US, even though it had disappeared in the last 20 years or so. But before, 60s, 70s, 80s of the last century, it was an important theme of elections. There, it comes in the racial variable, because very often criminality in the mind of some people is also connected to minorities and to immigrants, Let us not forget that Trump described Mexican immigrants as rapists, as criminals, as drug dealers, as a scourge on this country. So there he talks about his base. He's trying to tell them, you need me to defend you from these hordes of criminals that the Democrats and some federal judges would free and sick on you, and you would have tremendous problems, particularly because of the effort now being made in the country to reform the police, to limit the police power to inflict physical controls and even death on people they're trying to arrest, and to be trained in better ways to diffuse volatile encounters with the public. This also has created naturally a movement in favor of the police, in favor of their tactics as the thin blue line that separates us from the criminals. So there are ads now, definitely produced by Trump's campaign, describing a situation of chaos in our cities if we really follow up with the police reforms. So these are the major themes that he is facing, where he's trying to find a solution. With coronavirus, the vaccine, that would be his salvation. The problem will be, is it really true that it works? Or it has been pushed and hastened on us just to serve its purposes. The second is the economy, that is in a very serious crisis, enormous contraction of our economy, big loss in the PIB, and the need to really address it correctly. And third is the whole issue of law and order, racial relations, the history of the Civil War in the Confederacy and the statues of the generals in the South. This is another theme, very important to his base. And he has there to try to appease them and present himself as their defender.
In the case of Joe Biden, he's about to announce his candidate for vice president. What sort of impact could have in favor or against his favorability in this campaign, one way or the other?
Normally, the vice president doesn't really play such a major role in the result of the elections. It doesn't really have that much of a weight in the minds of the electorate. But in the case of Biden, it might, because, for example, Trump constantly stresses that Biden is an old man. Now, there is only 3-year difference between the two. So it is a little bit hilarious for a 74-year-old to disparage a 77-year-old as if it is such an enormous difference in age. But that is what Trump does. And it is true that Biden will conclude his presidency, if he is elected, when he's about 82 years of age. And so who the vice president is, in a way, can be seen as his potential successor. And this is why this year is so important, that the selection of the vice president is kind of his last will and testament, his living will, as we can say, for when he will terminate his presidency, because he has already indicated that probably he will not run again, if elected, for a second term. So that's why this has acquired quite a bit of importance, and rightly so, because a vice president in 4 years would acquire the experience, the contacts, the gravity, the know-how to then take over in the next campaign in the aspiration of the term in 2024. So that is why. There is also the issue of women being selected to finally break this barrier for them. Sure, we had Geraldine Ferraro many years ago, the first woman to be selected as potential vice president and ran, but lost, in part because her husband was then accused of being part of the mafia in New York, etc. Then Hillary Clinton. But this is the few and far in between in the history of the country. So that's also another reason why it is important that it will be a woman. And here there is the whole question: should it be a white woman? Should it be a Latino woman? Should it be an Afro-American woman? And there are those who think that an Afro-American woman would be the best selection because of the reivindication of blacks in this country, about having been forgotten, abused, and neglected, and not being able to share in the power. And also because Biden needs very much the Afro-American vote, desperately, particularly in the South of the United States. And so most probably it could be an Afro-American woman.
So finally, Emilio, who wins the election on November 3rd?
Well, we don't know, of course. I certainly personally hope it will be Biden, because the country really needs a rest from the turmoil, the changes, the one policy announced one day and contradicted the next one, the old fights that the president gets into with the European Union, NATO, other allies. I think people really want some peace and some stability and some predictability, and most of all, transparency and truthfulness. So I would hope that Biden wins, but we shall see.
Emilio Viano, thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.